Thank you for the introduction, and hello everyone, nice to meet you. So tonight we're going to be talking about naming products and features for the global market and coming up with really effective naming strategies for localization. So when it comes to naming new products, new features, new brands, every detail really matters. When you carefully plan your naming strategy out, it can really hit all the marks. It can meet both the needs of overseas users, but also achieve business goals. But when naming is done improperly, hastily, names can end up actually confusing users and failing to achieve product market fit. So tonight, we'll be talking about how to propose names to stakeholders and better guide their decision-making when it comes to launching new products or rebranding existing ones. And the goal here is to really put together a proposal that demonstrates clear thinking and methodology rather than just throwing a bunch of name ideas into a chat and hoping for the best. So tonight, our agenda, first we'll be giving kind of a broad overview on why naming matters, look at some examples of localization strategies, and then we'll start looking into the framework and process for pitching names and all the things you'll need to consider. And then finally, we'll look into some examples, both some real use cases and also some templates that you can start using in your work when it comes to naming. So what you'll take away from today's talk, you'll learn a little bit more about naming elements, the elements of effective feature naming for localization. And as I mentioned before, we'll walk through processes and how to align stakeholders on your naming strategy, including coming up with some criteria that you can all agree on and get everyone together on the same page. And then finally, I'll share some templates as well so that you can get started on your own naming proposals. And one small disclaimer I wanted to make. So the concept of naming can actually broadly refer to the process of naming identifiers and taxonomies. But for the purposes of tonight's talk, we'll be focusing more on naming specifically for new features and products and how that works for localization. So before we get into the talk, I just wanted to share a little bit about myself. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. My name is Bridget. I am a senior content strategist at AliExpress based here in Hangzhou. I actually have worked in China for over a decade. Previously, I was in Shanghai, but also some other cities around China. And my background is actually in design and media. So I started off as a designer at first and then moved into content later on. And last but not least, I'm originally from the US. My hometown is Detroit in Michigan.
But yeah, let's just get into it. A little bit enough about me and more about naming. So let's talk about why naming matters. And for a lot of you, especially working in localization, you've probably seen this example before. Coca-Cola launched in China in 1928. And this is the name that they chose, which is Coca-Cola. And the rough translation is tasty fun, which is a really, I guess, strong localization strategy here. But there's this kind of, I guess, internet meme that's been going around that Coca-Cola actually was named Kado Kanla, which actually made absolutely no sense. And so there's this wide misconception that Coca-Cola, when they initially launched in China, they got their name completely wrong. What actually happened is that Coca-Cola, indeed, they entered the market in 1928, but they had no name to begin with. And so this other name that you had seen on the previous slide there was coming from sellers. But when Coca-Cola was actually thinking of their strategy of launching in China, they really had to consider all 200 different characters in order to find the most proper combination. And so Coca-Cola really put a lot of thought into this. And the lesson to take away here is that when you're coming up with product names, there's a lot that you need to consider. And, there's a lot that goes into it. And so the same can be said as well for new products and features. So why naming matters? Think about, when you're using a product. Let's say you log in and you have the standard features like your account and sign in, login. But let's say you're introducing new concepts. Every time you introduce a new concept, you're adding cognitive load for users. And when you decide to actually start naming each of those features individually, you're adding additional burden to them. You're making the user do the work rather than making things simpler for them. And so it's really important when you're naming things to determine whether or not you actually need to what we call IP, which is, creating a brand specifically to that product, or just creating something a little bit more simpler. So another thing to keep in mind is just documenting your vocabulary and making sure that the whole workflow is intuitive. And so this quote comes from Scott Kuby, who's an industry expert on these matters. I'll be sharing the link to this a little bit later, so you can read this example. So when talking about actually naming features and giving branded names to features, like how do you actually decide how to name it? Here's how we do it at AliExpress. So when we're talking about official features, when we're doing games, promotions, we kind of see that as suitable for having an official branded name. But for other things like, general section headers, product elements, benefits, we don't give those a branded name. We don't give those, the title case name. Because if we start doing that, then it creates more confusion for the users. Now, for other areas like services or specialized features, we proceed with caution here and kind of deal with it on a case-by-case basis. And this is just, an example for how we do it as an e-commerce app, but for other apps, other industries, you might have specific guidelines that might work more suitably for your app. So really, it depends on what you need and what your business needs. But this is just an example. Now, naming for localization is something that you really need to take into consideration. Naming can actually be quite complex in other languages. So, for example, in German and Indonesian, capitalization is actually much different than in English. So, if you're deciding to give, branded product names to things, consider that added burden for those languages. And also, for those of you working in localization, if English is your source, actually you have to consider that other languages can be anywhere from 30 to 60% longer. And so this is actually a chart that we like to use a lot at AliExpress to show our stakeholders, like when you allot space to content in your design, consider all the other languages and how the length might actually increase. And consider that not just for your product name, but also other elements of your app as well. So that's something really important to consider. Now let's go into the naming framework. So how do you actually decide how to name things? And, as I mentioned before, naming is a really important process. It's no small undertaking. Your name pitching strategy should really be considered as equally as important as the visual design and the overall branding strategy. And so this is what the goal of this is, to really guide your stakeholders to name products through your clear thinking and methodology, and also consider those local market perspectives, right? Like I mentioned before, you don't want to just send them a short list of names. You actually want to give them the tools and the guides that they need to make the decision on their own. And, putting more professional standards and processes into place, so that when they're finally ready to choose a name, it's a collaborative process, and it's really taking all the important factors into consideration. So let's talk a little bit about the process. And as I mentioned previously, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. There are different steps that you can either, exclude or include in your process, but the main goal here is to divide it into three steps, or three phases. So the first is the research and concept phase. This is really where you're starting to do your analysis, defining your criteria, which I'll get into shortly, coming up with your shortlist based on that criteria, and then taking a lot of other steps, such as reviewing the localization, testing how it works out with users, and then finally preparing your pitch for stakeholders based on the evaluation of the criteria that you came up with before. And then you move on into the proposal stage, so pitching the idea to stakeholders, iterating where necessary, because let's be honest, the ideas that you pitch might not always be according to what they want or what the business needs. And then from there, once you finally finalize the solution, then going on to launching and review, going into the content creation process, seeing how your name works with all the creative assets, analyzing the data performance, conducting any follow-up usability tests, and then coming up with your action plan. So do you want to actually keep this name? Do we need to do other iterations? And then once you've decided from there what to do, that's when you start uploading all of your naming content and information to your term base, your content library, or whatever content storage tools you have available. So let's talk a little bit first about that first stage, which is the research and concept development part. So before you even go into the short list of names, there's something really basic that you need to do, which is considering the basic project overview. This might be, a simple aligning with stakeholders, having a meeting with them to understand the project a little bit better, getting to know what their business targets are, really understanding what their requirements are. Maybe they have specific criteria about the name that they want to include in this name, and then looking at the design assets. So, for example, has the design already been started? If so, where would the name appear in different touch points throughout the app? And then finally, you want to think about the overall strategy as well for the product and how that might influence what you actually propose. So let's say you've got all of your project analysis ready. Now it's time to go into your competitive audit. So there are a couple of things you can do here. One of the things that I use a lot is Google Trends. It's actually very helpful for seeing what users are searching for all over the world. If you're not sure what keywords are strong enough for your project, this is a great way to analyze which ones are actually best and most suitable for your project. And also doing a competitor analysis. So looking on the right here, compiling a chart, showing your competitors screenshots of their app, showing the name that they actually use, analyzing their mechanics, how the mechanics maybe are different from the ones that you're using, and then also, coming up with a brief concept explanation as well. And here you can also even look into pros and cons, like maybe what the competitors are doing is not actually the strategy you want to follow. But either way, this gives you a more complete, holistic view of what you're trying to do with this project. And then the criteria. So this step is super important. This will help you guide and identify how you actually name the product going on. So this will help you create a more balanced and objective standard to evaluate the names. And then once you have this criteria, you can actually align it with your stakeholders so that the process is truly collaborative and everyone's kind of working together on this. You can also use this as an opportunity to analyze your style guide and see what will or won't work. So I've included some example criteria for your name here. You can change it depending on your needs. For example, I've included one criteria here, which is descriptive, which is where you want the name to be really correct in conveying the exact meaning, but maybe your stakeholders want to do something a little bit more creative here, something that will be in their eyes more memorable to users. So in that case, you'll want to add that into your criteria. Another really important criteria that we like to include in our projects here at AliExpress is localizable. So seeing how the name translates for different countries, taking into account, cultural considerations, making sure that the name you choose isn't offensive in other markets, avoiding any negative connotations. And then also no conflict is really important as well. Making sure that your name that you choose doesn't conflict with something you already have within your product. Otherwise, users are going to be very confused. And you're going to have conflicting names here. Another conflict area to look into is other names from other services as well. Maybe you don't want to choose something that's exactly what your competitors have. Otherwise, your users might get confused. So you've chosen your criteria, you've aligned with your stakeholders. Now it's time to really get into your name shortlist, and this is where the creative work happens. So when you're coming up with your name shortlist, this is where you'll be briefly explaining each concept, maybe coming up with some bullet points, demonstrating use cases, so showing where the name might appear in the design, taking character count into consideration. You can even create your own wireframes. So you can use, drawing tools or use digital wireframes to show how that name might work in the design. And then for each concept that you're working on, you can also do a pros and cons list and really assess the strengths and weaknesses so that your stakeholders can better understand how this name works or doesn't work with the strategy that they're trying to do. And finally, this is kind of like a bonus step, but it's very helpful, which is kind of developing a whole content messaging framework around this name. So you might want to come up with a sample slogan or some sample creative content. For example, with your product name, maybe you want to include some example push notifications or emails to just show how that name would work when you're trying to get users to use this product. And finally, looking into keywords. So what I mean by keywords here is what kind of content you would include in your creative content or in your future content. So really kind of building a foundation for how you'll market this product in the future. So now that you've got your shortlisted names, now it's time to analyze and assess how they work for localization. So here you can create a chart where you show, how the name might localize differently. Maybe you want to keep the original name, maybe you want to do a direct translation, or maybe you want to do something entirely localized. This is a great way to look to assess the different options. And then you can also evaluate all the shortlisted names with your localization team to see what will actually work and what will not. And from there, you can build that into your evaluation standards a little bit later. So the next part of this process is quite important. This is testing the feasibility, and what I mean by feasibility is how the name works with your users, but also how the name might work with your relevant teams. So you want to check the names that you're proposing with legal and PR to avoid any compliance risks, to avoid any publicity risks, and then once you've kind of established that there are no risks, then you can go on and test your shortlisted names with users. So some common methods here might be usability tests, using platforms like user testing, Userlytics, running hallway tests. So hallway tests are a usability test that allows you to literally go into a hallway and do some quick checks with real live users, and so they can assess and give you feedback on the spot. And then also you can try surveys. There are lots of different user testing methods here that you can try this out. And why this is great is that you can actually run potential names with these customers, which will reveal insights that maybe you didn't consider before. So for example, a user might say, I don't understand what this feature is, and maybe you need to rework your naming strategy a bit. And the great thing about usability tests is that 5 users is actually an optimal sample size. So you can, the theory here from Nielsen Norman Group, which is a leading user research agency, is that you can actually find most usability problems with a design within 5 to 15 users. So that real user feedback can really give you a better idea on which names are more suitable before you actually start going into production. Also, some tips here when you're testing with users, try to include screenshots in your test if you can, just so you can see how the user understands the whole holistic product. And then once you've finished all that testing, make sure you're summarizing your key findings to stakeholders so that they have a document and a reference to go off of. So let's say you've got your feasibility study done. Now it's finally time to get to the evaluation part. So this is the kind of culmination of all your research. You'll be taking all of those shortlisted names that you developed earlier, and then you're matching them against the criteria that you defined before together with your stakeholders. So this will help you provide an objective final assessment, and that will help your stakeholders make a better informed decision. Now, I recommend here that you highlight 1 or 2 top options to, further guide your stakeholders and narrow things down. But, keep in mind that what you propose and your top options might not necessarily be what the stakeholders go with in the end. But the goal here is not to be perfect. It's to make sure that the name that's finally chosen actually aligns to professional standards and really considers all these important things. Yeah. So now that we've completed the research and conceptual phase, now it's time to move on to the proposal phase. And this is I only have 2 bullet points here, but it's quite short. So first you're pitching, and then you're iterating where possible. So for the pitching part, you can create a short, easy to follow document. I've included a template, which I'll share with the group later. And this will really help guide the decision making. You can include that evaluation chart at the end and summarize all the research that you shared before and collected before. Documenting your work is also really important because let's say future stakeholders who have no background of this project are pulled in. This document can help them understand, why we chose the name we did, why certain options were not followed, and it can give them a better idea on the product strategy moving forward. This is also important for, let's say, your product or your feature, the mechanism has changed or the scope has changed. You can see from this documentation where things maybe are out of date and where things need to be upgraded. Yeah, and then in the proposal phase, let's say your stakeholders aren't happy with what's been proposed. So then, in case you have further rounds of changes, this document can help you develop new concepts quite quickly. You can, look at your previous research and compare those new names. Let's say, you want to come up with new criteria, then you would need to adjust where needed. But you would the great thing about having this document here is that you would be able to evaluate new names according to that criteria. Just one thing to note here is that you might need to be prepared for multiple rounds of feedback. So make sure that it's not, scope creeping, things aren't getting out of scope. Make sure at the end of the day, you need to follow your project timeline. So let's go into the final stage of this process, which is the launch and review phase. So here we've got the content creation step. Once you've actually launched the project, now you've got to come up with all your content assets. You'll want to analyze the performance, the business performance of this project, see if your metrics are being hit, if things need to be adjusted. Here is also a great opportunity to conduct follow-up usability tests. So you had those kind of initial usability tests early on in the process, but here is an opportunity to actually see what users see about this product and work with the product in real time. And then from there, you'll be able to see if you actually need to iterate this name and this product even more, or if the name is suitable. And then from there, once you know your iteration strategy and your next steps, then you can start uploading all of your terms to your library. So let's talk a little bit about each step of this, and I've condensed it into kind of 3 sections here. The first is the content creation step. So you've selected your name. Now you need to make sure all of your assets align with the standards that you've come up for that name. You'll want to make sure that all of your promotional content really aligns with that. And then you'll want to review any content you've got online currently to make sure that you're avoiding any inconsistencies. So for example, let's say during the naming process, you decided, or your stakeholders decided, actually, we want to change this name into this name. Well, you need to make sure that the content that you've already produced is aligned with that new name. So this is a really important step to make sure that your users aren't getting confused. And then finally, once things are kind of settled, this is a great opportunity to develop more detailed standards and guidelines for future use cases, creating documentation for your content colleagues, but also for your project stakeholders as well. And next, then you'll want to analyze the results and next steps. So how is this project doing? This is a great opportunity to see how it aligns with the metrics, the target metrics, and see if it's hitting those business results. Also, this is a great time to see how the product fits with user needs. So as I mentioned before, you can conduct another round of usability tests to capture more user insights, see maybe if there's some gaps that you didn't consider before. And then from there, you can create a quick recap report, or if you're successful, you can do a case study to show how your work actually impacted the product. Let's say that you want to make some changes. So then in this stage, you would need to go back and prepare for another round of iteration based on the standards that you mentioned before. And then the final step is to add all of your content to the library. So uploading to Termbase, as I mentioned before, and just preparing necessary documentation for all your future project collaborators. Yeah. So I'm going to share some examples here. I'll show you quickly some methodologies that we followed using different steps from this process that I outlined before. The first project was we were actually naming a new feature at AliExpress. And so the methodology we followed was that we did some competitor analysis first. So we were looking at competitors to see if they were offering similar services, finding out what their mechanics were, and then looking very deeply into those mechanics and looking at keywords to figure out what terms they were most commonly using. We used a method called keyword mining to figure out what were the top keywords that were being used. We also did keyword monitoring through Google Trends, which I shared before. It's a great tool to gauge which terms are most popular in different markets. And so actually, this is a great way to find out, like, for example, that this term might be more popular in one country, but maybe another term is more popular in another country. And so from this tool, you can actually observe which concepts users are most likely to recognize and be more familiar with. And then finally, for this project, we did a quick risk assessment. So we reviewed the rest of our platform to see if there were other similarly named features. Well, we found actually that there was, and that potentially was going to create a naming conflict. So what we did is we worked with the heads of product for the other product, and we pulled in some stakeholders to see if we could come up with another naming strategy for the other products. And from there, we were just able to align everyone and bring everyone together onto the same page on our next steps. So that was one example. And then the second example here was for a feature renaming. So this was for a product that was already online, actually, but we had a hypothesis that maybe the name wasn't actually working very well for our users. So what we did first before going into this product and this project was to actually analyze the data. We were looking at different data from different segmentation groups to understand where the user pain points were happening. And from there, we were able to develop a hypothesis. And then from our hypothesis, we were able to come up with some user testing. We ran some usability tests, both in the discovery phase, but also when we actually had more naming concepts ready to collect detailed user insights about the names that we were proposing. And then from there, we were able to select a few top options that best matched the user's needs. And then we were also able to share those top recommendations to our stakeholders so that they could make the best decision when they eventually launched this new product. And finally, the third methodology that we followed here was localization. So we worked with our localization team to develop local names that were more suitable for our different markets, because in some markets, one name worked better than the other, because users in different markets have different needs. So those are some example case studies. And next, I'll share a short recap and also some resources. So just a quick recap here. When you're naming products, three things are super important. The first is conducting that thorough research. It's not just about coming up with a list of names and sending it over WeChat or sending it over email. It's actually about conducting thorough research, comprehensive research, putting together a really cohesive strategy. Naming, as I mentioned before, it should be equally as important as your visual design and overall brand strategy. And so when you're putting these proposals together, it's really a great opportunity to showcase to business the value that you bring through all the research that you provide. The second most important thing here to remember is that aligning on criteria is a really important way to collaborate with your stakeholders and get them on board to your ideas. It makes it more of a group process rather than you're providing your recommendations, because collaboration is a great way to get people on board with your ideas and build influence. So before coming up with those short lists of names, along with your research, it's really important to come up with criteria together with your stakeholders in order to really objectively evaluate which names are most suitable for this project. And then finally, a really important thing to consider here is how the name will localize. As I mentioned before, some names might work in some markets and might not work in others. So really assess how those shortlisted names work, either with your localization team or with user tests. And that way you'll be able to identify risks and make sure that the names that you provide are really best aligned to a wider range of users. Yep, so that's a recap. I've got some resources here. I've included QR codes that you can scan. The first is a naming proposal template. So I've included a version on QQ Docs and another version on Google Docs. I'll also be sharing this in the group later. This is a great way to just put together a quick proposal. It's a template. I'll keep this on the screen here for a couple seconds. And then also the next page, I've got a quick checklist. So all the steps that you should be taking before you put together a name pitching proposal. And again, I'll share these links in the group as well. Yeah, and then also I've included some further reading here. Maybe I can just share my screen. But there's a great article here from Spotify Design about how they name their personalized playlists. An interesting find that I had in this article was actually that they removed the word "your" because they found that it was very obvious actually that these playlists were personalized. So that was an unnecessary word. Another interesting article that I found was the article from before about product naming. I'll share that in the group later. And then also there's this book here called Naming Things, which is it talks about the problem in software engineering, how it's difficult to come up with terms. Yeah. So I want to say thank you everyone for joining tonight. I've included my WeChat code here. Let's connect. I'm looking forward to chatting tonight with all of you, and thank you for joining. And now I guess it's time for questions.
Oh my God, thank you so much,
Hello.
Bridget. Hey.
Hello.
I have a question
Yeah.
that actually was already asked. It's about the AI implementation. I just see a huge potential of automating or at least in part help the process you just described. So is that something you guys are actively working on at the moment?
At the moment, I use AI to come up with ideas, but for the most part, it's not something that I would say is officially built into the process. It's more like it's a tool, a means to a ways, you know. I'll use it if I'm kind of out of ideas or I'm looking for more research about the industry. So sometimes if I'm not sure like what keywords to start with in Google Trends, for example, I might look into AI to see the ideas that they have there.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks Ricardo for your question. We do have a lot of questions asked during the talk. The question about AI we just dealt with. Another question from Tila is, Bridget, what is your process to align with stakeholders on the naming ideas?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the first things, as I mentioned before, is getting involved really early in the process. So getting information on the project background, getting those kind of early documents. And then from there, it's really important, as I mentioned, to get your naming criteria together. And so this is something where you can either, you can put it in a group chat, or you can even call a meeting and say, hey, like I suggest this criteria, what do you think? And that way you can get people more involved in the process and more proactive with it. And then once you've done that and you've aligned everyone together on those kind of key things, then you've got your document ready. And this is where you can quickly present your proposal. And at this stage, since you've already been collaborating very early on in the process, hopefully by now you'll have more agreement and alignment on what you're finally presenting. So yeah, my tip here is to just get involved really early on, and be open to change as well, because even if you've aligned early on and then you present your proposal and they don't like it, that's fine. Just be open and willing to make changes. So yeah, just collaboration is essential.
Okay, I follow up on this one. Question from Xiaoying. At which stage of the product cycle do you start the naming process? Yeah.
That's a great question. Yeah. So normally we would start this process while we're still in the design stage, while we're still kind of coming up with all the design templates. That's the ideal process. But often, things will happen where you've confirmed the name, and you've confirmed the design, but then, for some reason it needs to be changed. So in that case, that makes things a little bit more complicated. But at this stage, before you've launched, there's still time to save it. But then you also have cases where, the product has launched, and what you're finding is the business results aren't great. So during the testing phase after launch, when you've got your A/B testing going on, this is also a great opportunity to think of renaming as well. So I would say the best kind of points to come up with this naming process: one, the design process when you're still really early on in the project planning; two, before you've sort of gone into deep production; and then three, after launch when you're starting to get the data results. But the most ideal time would be pretty early on, like while you're designing the product itself.
Okay. We have a second question attached to that one, also from Xiaoying, which is, do you need to push other stakeholders to kick off everything as soon as possible? And if you allow me, I will also add one of my questions to it, which I believe is linked, is any tips on how to best influence your stakeholders on a particular name option? And what if the stakeholders still insist on using a name that we as content team do not necessarily recommend because, for example, the boss, the leader wants it? Any tips on that, Bridget?
Yeah. Okay. That was a lot of questions. Also, my screen is a little bit frozen. I'm not sure if I'm frozen right now. But
You are frozen, but it's not awkward.
Okay. So the first question was, could you repeat each question one by one?
Yes. Do you need, so question from Xiaoying is, do you need to push other stakeholders to kick off everything as soon as possible? And added to that is that, do you need to push stakeholder in a specific direction, namely the one that you would recommend? Let's put it this way.
Yeah. So yes, you do need to push stakeholders pretty early on, because oftentimes, like, the name that you choose has massive impacts on the design. So this involves kind of constantly following up with the stakeholders to make sure that they've decided on a name in time. You can kind of, if they're kind of lagging and going slower than you'd like, this is where you can push them a little bit more and say, we risk delays here by a decision not being made soon. Being gentle, but also making the stakeholder aware of the risk. The second question was about pushing stakeholders towards picking a specific name. So yeah, this is a great question. I would say this is where your criteria comes into play again, making sure that you're evaluating things according to those criteria, but also being open to other names as well. So that's why in your short list, you're going to be providing a few options, but being open to the fact that maybe others will be there along the way. Now, hopefully, the names that the stakeholders choose are from your official shortlist, but if not, then you need to remind them and evaluate the names that they're proposing fairly, according to the criteria that you defined before. But also, if the names don't meet those criteria, then really define the risks and the problems related to localization there. So for example, let's say they want to go with a really creative name, but users are going to be, you think that users are going to be confused by this name. So you can offer to run a user test. You can show how users feel about that. You can also, bring up the industry data that you've provided before, to show them that the name maybe risks XYZ problems. Yeah. And then the third question was, can you repeat for me, please?
I removed it from the second time I asked the question. That was a bit too much. But we've got another question from Pedro. Thank you for the amazing presentation, Bridget. You mentioned a case where you had to rename a product. How long was the process to rename it? And have you guys ever had a product whose name was deemed inappropriate abroad, even after careful research?
Great question. So for the renaming of the product, that was something actually that had been online for quite a while, probably more than a year. And we decided to rename it because we were, collecting data over several months. And what we found is that, as I mentioned, some of the data wasn't right. So the naming process itself took about, I would say, maybe half a month to a month. And this is where we were doing our initial user tests, kind of doing our early discovery. And then when we had the opportunity to rebrand it, then we actually ran a second user test. And that we were able to come up with our proposal. With that proposal, when we actually had a name, there was a lot of back and forth. I would say that took around 2 weeks. And it was quite challenging because even though we had users saying one thing, stakeholders were saying another thing. But in the end, we were able to come kind of on the same page, and we were able to launch the name that our users had selected. So yeah, I would say it took about a month, excluding all the discovery research that we did prior to that. And then the second question, could you repeat as well?
Yes. Second question is, have you guys ever had a product whose name was deemed inappropriate abroad, even after careful research?
I can't think of a specific example. The ones where it was inappropriate abroad, it was because there was no research done. So, for example, we had a sale name that did not suit the users of a certain market, but that was because we didn't do any research prior. We try to really take the research very seriously when launching new products overseas.
Okay. Yeah, research are key, right, in this process.
Absolutely.
Okay. We do not have other question in the chat, but if anyone wants to ask Bridget quickly. If not,
I actually have one question, and it's a tricky one.
yes.
Okay, Bridget, you mentioned multiple times how important it is to have those naming options checked. For example, if you're working for international market, how important it is to check it with language specialists or users, localization team. What if you don't have means to do that? How can you still assess a name?
Oh, that's a tricky one. So you don't have access to localization specialists. You don't have access to users. For this one, I would maybe say look into the keywords and do your competitor analysis and compare the name that you have to what competitors have. Let's say your name is quite different from what competitors have. Then in this case, you can demonstrate to your stakeholders, hey, there's this serious gap here. Everyone is doing it this way. We're doing it this way. Clearly, there's something happening here, and we need to close that gap by following more overseas standards.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.